Welcome, weary travelers of the midnight hour, to the twisted corridors of a world where humanity's darkest emotions take physical form and prowl the shadows with malevolent intent. Tonight, we descend into the disturbing depths of Jujutsu Kaisen, where the monsters that haunt our nightmares are born not from imagination but from the poisonous wellspring of human hearts. Here, in this realm where curses feast on fear and despair breeds destruction, we shall explore the unsettling truths that lurk beneath the surface of supernatural warfare. So settle into the comfortable darkness, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of negative energy flowing through tormented souls, and allow yourself to drift as we trace the horrifying origins of evil itself. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let the infinite void of sleep embrace you as we begin our journey through the malevolent landscape where humanity creates its own destruction. The genesis of every curse that stalks the hidden world of Jujutsu sorcery begins not in some primordial realm of darkness, but in the beating hearts and troubled minds of ordinary human beings living ordinary lives filled with extraordinary suffering. This fundamental truth represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the supernatural reality that governs the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, that every monster, every malevolent entity that preys upon the innocent, every grotesque horror that transforms peaceful spaces into battlegrounds of terror, originates from emotions so universally human that none can claim immunity from their influence. Cursed energy, the invisible force that powers both protection and destruction in this world, flows like poison through the collective unconscious of humanity, accumulating wherever fear takes root, wherever hatred festers, wherever despair drowns hope in an ocean of suffering that seems to have no shore. The mathematical precision with which negative emotions transform into supernatural threats reveals a cosmic cruelty that makes even the most hardened sorcerers question whether their calling represents salvation or merely another form of damnation, another way for humans to destroy each other while claiming noble purpose. The locations where curses manifest most frequently read like a catalogue of human institutional failures, spaces where society has allowed suffering to accumulate unchecked until it achieves critical mass and spawns entities whose only purpose is to inflict the same pain that created them upon anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. Schools, those temples of learning and growth where young minds should flourish, become breeding grounds for malevolence when bullying, academic pressure, and social isolation create environments so toxic that the very air becomes thick with cursed energy, waiting for the right trigger to coalesce into something that can kill. Hospitals, meant to be sanctuaries of healing where the sick find hope and the dying find peace, transform into hunting grounds for curses born from the accumulated anguish of countless patients who suffered without adequate care, families who watched loved ones deteriorate despite medical promises, and healthcare workers whose compassion was slowly eroded by a system that prioritized efficiency over empathy. The irony that places dedicated to preserving life become sources of supernatural death reflects a deeper truth about how institutions can become corrupted by the very problems they were designed to solve. Prisons represent perhaps the most obvious example of how human systems create the conditions for curse formation, but the reality proves far more complex and disturbing than simple correlation between crime and supernatural manifestation. The curses that emerge from correctional facilities are born not just from the anger and desperation of inmates, but from the systematic dehumanization that transforms both prisoners and guards into something less than human, creating cycles of violence and hatred that persist long after sentences have been served and continue to poison communities for generations. The psychological mechanism by which negative emotions achieve physical manifestation operates according to principles that reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship with reality itself. Fear, the most primal and universal of human responses to danger, becomes the raw material from which defensive curses emerge, entities that embody not protection, but the paranoid certainty that threats lurk everywhere, and that preemptive violence represents the only rational response to an inherently hostile universe. Hatred, that corrosive emotion that consumes both its object and its host, generates curses characterized by their single-minded focus on destruction and their inability to distinguish between guilty and innocent targets. These entities represent pure malice given form, creatures whose existence serves no purpose beyond inflicting suffering, and whose presence in any environment guarantees that tragedy will follow in their wake, like smoke trailing from a fire that can never be completely extinguished. Jealousy and envy, emotions that arise from humanity's tendency to measure worth through comparison with others rather than internal standards of value and meaning, create curses that specialize in undermining success and happiness wherever they encounter it. These entities feed on the gap between desire and reality, growing stronger in environments where social inequality and unfulfilled ambition create conditions ripe for resentment to flourish, unchecked by wisdom or compassion. Despair, perhaps the most dangerous of all negative emotions in terms of curse generation, produces entities that embody the absolute absence of hope and actively work to spread that absence to everyone they encounter. These curses represent existential threats not just to individual lives but to the fundamental human capacity for optimism and growth, their presence transforming even the most resilient spirits into hollow shells that see no point in continued existence. The most disturbing aspect of this supernatural ecosystem is not that negative emotions can kill, but that they do so indiscriminately, targeting the innocent along with the guilty, the compassionate along with the cruel, the hopeful along with the despairing. Children who have never harbored malice in their hearts become victims of curses born from adult failures, their deaths serving as fuel for even more powerful entities in a cycle that seems designed to perpetuate itself across generations with mechanical precision. Educational institutions provide particularly clear examples of how seemingly normal human interactions can accumulate into supernatural threats that endanger everyone who enters their sphere of influence. The curse that manifested at Satozakura High School, where Yuji Itadori first encountered the supernatural world, was born not from any single traumatic event, but from years of accumulated stress, disappointment, and unfulfilled potential that characterized the experience of countless students who passed through its halls without finding the support they needed to flourish. The athletic programs that should have provided healthy outlets for competition and physical development instead became pressure cookers, where young people learned that their worth was measured solely by performance metrics that reduced human complexity to simple statistics. The academic environment that should have nurtured curiosity and critical thinking instead emphasized conformity and memorization, creating conditions where creativity and independent thought were actively discouraged in favor of predictable compliance. Social hierarchies within the school created artificial divisions between students based on popularity, academic achievement, and family background, fostering resentment and isolation among those who found themselves relegated to lower positions through circumstances largely beyond their control. The bullying that emerged from these hierarchies was not merely interpersonal conflict, but symptomatic of systemic failures that allowed cruelty to flourish while punishing those who attempted to challenge or escape it. Teachers and administrators, overwhelmed by institutional demands and social expectations that prioritized measurable outcomes over individual student welfare, found themselves complicit in systems that they recognized as harmful but felt powerless to change. Their frustration and guilt contributed to the accumulation of negative energy that eventually spawned the curse that nearly claimed Yuji's classmates during what should have been a routine club activity. Medical facilities present even more disturbing examples of how institutional dysfunction can create conditions ripe for curse formation, as the suffering that occurs within their walls often involves not just physical pain, but the psychological anguish that comes with confronting mortality and systemic inadequacy in moments of greatest vulnerability. The curse that manifested at the hospital where Yuji's grandfather spent his final days was born from the accumulated despair of families who watched loved ones deteriorate while receiving care that prioritized efficient processing over compassionate treatment, overworked medical staff, constrained by bureaucratic policies and resource limitations that prevented them from providing the level of care they knew their patients deserved, experienced chronic stress and moral injury that contributed to an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos disguised as professional competence. Their suppressed frustration and guilt created negative energy that mixed with patient fear and family grief to form a toxic psychological environment where curse formation became inevitable. The elderly patients who spent their final weeks surrounded by strangers in sterile environments that bore no resemblance to the homes and communities where they had built their lives, contributed their own layers of sadness and regret to combat the accumulating negative energy. Their sense of abandonment by families too busy or too distant to provide adequate support, combined with their awareness that their deaths would likely go unnoticed by a world that had already moved on without them, created particularly potent sources of cursed energy that fed on existential despair. Economic pressures that forced families to make impossible choices between financial survival and adequate care for aging relatives added another dimension to the suffering that characterized the facility's atmosphere, creating resentment and guilt that poisoned relationships at moments when love and support were most desperately needed. The curse that eventually emerged from this environment embodied all of these failures simultaneously, becoming a monster that fed on the gap between what medical care should provide and what it actually delivered to those most in need. The correctional system provides perhaps the most obvious examples of how institutional cruelty can create conditions for curse formation, but the reality proves more complex than simple correlation between criminal behavior and supernatural manifestation. The entities that emerge from prisons and jails are born not primarily from inmate anger, though that certainly contributes to their formation, but from the systematic dehumanization that transforms both prisoners and guards into participants in cycles of violence that corrupt everyone involved. Inmates subjected to conditions that prioritize punishment over rehabilitation find themselves trapped in environments that actively discourage positive change while providing no meaningful opportunities for growth or redemption. The hopelessness that results from recognizing that society has written them off as irredeemable creates particularly potent negative energy that feeds curse formation, while ensuring that the entities that emerge will embody the same destructive impulses that the system was supposedly designed to contain. Guards and administrative staff, initially motivated by desires to serve their communities and maintain public safety, find themselves gradually corrupted by institutional cultures that reward cruelty while punishing compassion, that celebrate dominance while discouraging any recognition of shared humanity between themselves and those under their authority. Their growing cynicism and moral numbness contribute to atmospheric conditions where curse formation becomes not just possible but inevitable. The families of both inmates and staff suffer their own forms of trauma as they watch loved ones disappear into a system that seems designed to destroy rather than heal, that creates more problems than it solves. while demanding ever greater resources and authority to address the chaos that its own dysfunction generates. Their frustration and grief add additional layers to the negative energy that accumulates within correctional facilities, creating compounds of suffering that produce curses characterized by their particular focus on perpetuating cycles of violence and retribution. The wider community's complicity in maintaining systems that they know to be both ineffective and inhumane adds a final element to curse formation within correctional environments, as collective guilt and willful ignorance about institutional failures create psychological conditions where supernatural threats can flourish while remaining invisible to those who might otherwise work to address their underlying causes. The endless cycle through which humans create the very monsters that prey upon them represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the supernatural reality that governs the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, revealing a cosmic justice that operates according to principles that seem designed to punish the species for its fundamental inability to learn from its own mistakes or break patterns of behavior that generate suffering across generations. With mathematical precision, each curse that manifests from accumulated negative emotions becomes a source of additional trauma for those who encounter it, creating new layers of fear, hatred, and despair that feed back into the system that created the original threat, ensuring that the cycle continues with exponentially increasing intensity as more powerful entities emerge from the psychological wreckage left by their predecessors. The sorcerers tasked with eliminating these supernatural threats find themselves caught in the same destructive cycle, their exposure to constant violence and death gradually eroding their own psychological stability, while the institutional systems that deploy them provide inadequate support for processing the trauma that comes with their calling. Many eventually succumb to the same negative emotions that create the curses they fight, becoming threats themselves, or simply withdrawing from a battle that seems designed to produce casualties rather than victories. The ordinary citizens who remain unaware of the supernatural war being fought in their shadows contribute to curse formation through their daily participation in systems and behaviors that prioritize short-term comfort over the Beckham long-term welfare, individual advantage over collective good, and willful ignorance over difficult truths that would require uncomfortable changes in lifestyle and worldview if honestly confronted. The recognition that every person carries within themselves the potential to contribute to curse formation through thoughts and emotions that seem perfectly natural and understandable represents perhaps the most unsettling truth about the wrecking world of Jujutsu sorcery, that the line between victim and perpetrator, between innocent and guilty, between human and monster, proves far thinner than anyone would prefer to acknowledge. This fundamental interconnection between human psychology and supernatural threat means that the war against curses can never truly be won through force alone, that each victory achieved through violence merely sets the stage for future defeats, as the trauma inflicted during combat generates new sources of negative energy that will eventually manifest as more powerful and dangerous entities than those that were destroyed to create them. The culling game represents the culmination of 1,000 years of meticulous planning by an entity whose understanding of human nature runs so deep and so cynical that it was able to design a system of mass slaughter disguised as a competition, where the very act of participation guarantees corruption while abstinence ensures death. Kenjaku's masterpiece of manipulation operates according to rules that exploit every weakness in human psychology, while providing no genuine avenue for escape or redemption, creating a scenario where ordinary people are systematically transformed into killers while believing they are merely struggling to survive circumstances beyond their control. The mechanics of the game itself reveal a mind that has studied human behavior across centuries of observation, understanding precisely which pressures and incentives will produce the desired behavioral changes in populations subjected to controlled stress. The binding vow that governs participation ensures that even those who enter the barriers accidentally or unwillingly become subject to rules they never agreed to follow, trapped within boundaries that exist not just in physical space but in the very fabric of reality itself, making escape impossible once the system has claimed its victims. The point system that drives competition within the game operates according to principles designed to maximize violence while providing psychological justification for increasingly brutal behavior, rewarding efficiency in killing while punishing any attempt to find alternative solutions to the survival challenge that participants face. Each human life reduced to a numerical value that can be accumulated and spent creates a framework where murder becomes not just acceptable but strategically necessary, transforming moral considerations into tactical calculations that gradually erode the ethical foundations that normally constrain human behavior. The requirement that participants kill at least one person within 19 days, or face immediate execution by the game's curse, creates time pressure that prevents careful consideration of alternatives, while ensuring that even the most reluctant players must eventually commit acts that would have been unthinkable to them under normal circumstances. This deadline mechanism exploits the human tendency to rationalize extreme behavior when survival is perceived to be at stake, gradually shifting moral baselines as participants convince themselves that temporary compromise with their values is justified by extraordinary circumstances. The rule allowing players to add new conditions to the game if they accumulate sufficient points creates the illusion that participants can influence their circumstances while actually providing additional mechanisms for psychological manipulation and control. Those who achieve temporary success within the system find themselves with apparent power to change the rules, but every modification they make serves Kenjaku's ultimate purpose, while binding them more completely to the game's fundamental structure of violence and exploitation. The barriers that contain each colony function not merely as physical constraints, but as psychological pressure chambers that intensify every negative emotion, while preventing the kind of social support and external perspective that might help participants maintain their sanity and moral compass under extreme stress. The isolation created by communication blackouts ensures that players cannot coordinate resistance or develop collective strategies that might threaten the game's basic premise, forcing them into individual survival mode, where cooperation becomes impossible and paranoia becomes rational. The inclusion of ordinary civilians within the barriers alongside trained sorcerers creates artificial hierarchies based purely on combat ability, while ensuring that the weakest participants become prey for those with supernatural powers, establishing dynamics that mirror the worst aspects of human social organization, while stripping away the cultural and legal constraints that normally prevent such relationships from developing into open predation. Children, elderly individuals, and disabled persons find themselves competing for survival against trained killers in scenarios where their death becomes inevitable unless they can convince more powerful players to protect them, usually at costs that compromise their dignity and agency. The psychological transformation that occurs within participants as they adapt to the game's requirements follows predictable patterns that Kenjaku has observed across centuries of human conflict, beginning with denial and moral outrage, before progressing through bargaining and rationalization toward eventual acceptance of violence as not just necessary but natural and appropriate, given their circumstances. The speed with which ordinary people abandon ethical principles that they previously considered fundamental to their identity reveals uncomfortable truths about the superficial nature of moral conviction when subjected to sustained pressure and immediate consequences. The collaborative dynamics that emerge within colonies demonstrate how survival pressure can temporarily override social divisions, while ultimately reinforcing them through competition for scarce resources and protective alliances, creating temporary communities that dissolve as soon as individual advantage requires betrayal of collective interests. The brief friendships and romantic attachments that develop between players serve primarily to create additional psychological leverage that can be exploited to force compliance with the game's demands, turning human connection into vulnerability rather than strength. The spectacle aspect of the game, with its public scorekeeping and dramatic reveals of player information, appeals to the same psychological mechanisms that drive entertainment consumption while desensitizing observers to the reality of mass murder occurring in their vicinity, gradually normalizing extreme violence as merely another form of competitive sport where casualties are expected and celebrated rather than mourned. The transformation of death into entertainment represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of how the game corrupts not just participants, but the broader society that witnesses its operation. The rule modifications that players implement as they gain influence within the system inevitably serve to increase rather than decrease the game's lethality and psychological pressure, as each participant's proposed changes reflect their adaptation to violence rather than resistance to it, demonstrating how the system's basic structure ensures that even apparent acts of rebellion actually strengthen its fundamental mechanisms of control and manipulation. Players who believe they are working to make the game more humane find themselves implementing rules that make survival even more dependent on willingness to kill, while those who embrace the system's violence openly create modifications that increase suffering for purely sadistic purposes. The timeline pressure created by Tsumiki's forced participation adds urgency that prevents careful planning while ensuring that rescue attempts must occur within the game's framework rather than through external intervention, forcing even the protagonists to participate in the system they seek to oppose, and thereby becoming complicit in its continuation and validation. The knowledge that loved ones are trapped within the game creates emotional leverage that Kenjaku exploits to ensure cooperation from individuals who might otherwise refuse to participate in mass slaughter disguised as competition. The revelation that many players were ordinary citizens transformed against their will into sorcerers through forced consumption of cursed objects adds another layer of violation to their circumstances, as they find themselves possessing powers they never wanted, while being held responsible for their use of those abilities in ways that serve the game's purposes rather than their own moral convictions. The involuntary nature of their transformation eliminates the element of choice that might otherwise provide psychological foundation for accepting responsibility for their actions, creating cognitive dissonance that facilitates moral compromise and behavioral adaptation. The interaction between veteran sorcerers and newly created players creates mentorship dynamics that inevitably focus on survival skills rather than ethical considerations, as the experienced practitioners find themselves in positions where teaching moral restraint effectively sentences their students to death, while instruction in efficient killing provides the only realistic path to continued existence. The corruption of educational relationships under these circumstances reflects broader patterns of how the game systematically undermines every positive human institution and relationship. The economic incentives created by the point system encourage players to view other human beings as resources to be harvested, rather than individuals deserving of moral consideration, gradually shifting psychological frameworks from ethical evaluation toward purely tactical calculation in ways that persist even after specific survival threats have been addressed. The transformation of human worth into quantified value that can be accumulated and exchanged represents a fundamental corruption of social bonds that normally constrain violence within communities. The geographic isolation of colonies prevents communication and coordination between different groups of players, while ensuring that successful strategies cannot be shared across barriers, forcing each group to independently develop approaches to survival that typically converge on increasing levels of violence and moral compromise. The prevention of collective learning and strategy development ensures that no group can develop alternative approaches that might threaten the game's basic premise of competitive killing as the primary mechanism for advancement and survival. The medical and psychological support that would normally be available to individuals subjected to extreme trauma is completely absent within the colonies, forcing players to process their experiences of violence and loss without professional guidance while under continued threat, creating conditions where adaptive responses to stress inevitably involve emotional numbing and moral disengagement that make future violence easier to commit and justify. The absence of healing resources ensures that psychological damage accumulates over time rather than being addressed and resolved. The religious and philosophical frameworks that might otherwise provide meaning and moral guidance during periods of extreme challenge are actively undermined by the game's structure, which rewards behavior that contradicts most ethical systems, while punishing adherence to principles of compassion and non-violence through immediate death or prolonged suffering. The systematic destruction of meaning-making systems leaves players without psychological resources for maintaining identity and values under pressure. The family relationships that exist between players within colonies create additional psychological torture, as parents are forced to watch children adapt to violence, while siblings find themselves competing for resources that only one can possess, transforming bonds of love and protection into sources of guilt and conflict that serve the game's purpose of maximizing psychological suffering alongside physical destruction. The corruption of family dynamics represents perhaps the most personally devastating aspect of how the system destroys human social organization. The gender dynamics that emerge within colonies reflect broader patterns of social inequality while being intensified by survival pressure and the absence of legal protections, creating environments where sexual violence and exploitation become additional tools for gaining advantage within the game's framework, while victims find themselves with no recourse or protection beyond their ability to secure powerful allies through further compromise of their dignity and agency. The age-related vulnerabilities that characterize colony populations ensure that the elderly and very young become burdens that drain resources while providing minimal competitive advantage, creating utilitarian calculations that gradually normalize abandonment and elimination of the weak as rational responses to resource scarcity, rather than moral failures that should be prevented through collective action and mutual support. The cultural and linguistic diversity that exists within some colonies initially provides opportunities for mutual learning and cross-cultural understanding, but the competitive framework of the game gradually transforms these differences into sources of suspicion and tribal identification that facilitate violence against those perceived as outsiders, while strengthening in-group loyalty among those who share common backgrounds and languages. The seasonal and environmental challenges that affect colony conditions add natural hardship to the artificial pressures created by the game's rules, ensuring that players must simultaneously cope with weather, food scarcity, and shelter needs while navigating interpersonal conflicts and survival competitions, creating compound stresses that accelerate psychological breakdown and moral compromise among populations already subjected to extreme pressure. The promise of eventual escape through game completion provides false hope that sustains participation, while ensuring that players remain invested in the system, even as they recognize its fundamental cruelty. As the possibility of freedom becomes conditional on successful navigation of challenges that require abandonment of the very values and relationships that would make freedom meaningful if it were achieved. The documentation and record-keeping that tracks player actions within colonies creates permanent evidence of moral compromises and violent acts that will follow survivors long after the game ends, ensuring that even those who escape physical confinement remain psychologically bound to their experiences through guilt and shame that cannot be resolved through external absolution or forgiveness, as the transformation they underwent was internal and permanent rather than circumstantial and temporary. In the annals of supernatural malevolence that have shaped human history from shadows deeper than any recorded chronicle, no entity represents a more profound violation of the sacred boundaries between self and other, between life and death, between identity and oblivion, than the consciousness that has worn 1,000 faces while maintaining a singular purpose that spans millennia of carefully orchestrated suffering. Kenjaku exists as the ultimate predator of human essence, a parasitic intelligence that treats bodies not as vessels of individual souls, but as disposable costumes to be worn, discarded, and replaced according to the shifting requirements of plans. So vast and complex that their full scope defies comprehension by minds constrained within single lifetimes and singular perspectives. The fundamental horror of Kenjaku's existence lies not in any supernatural power he wields, though his abilities transcend normal categories of possibility, but in the casual violation of the most basic assumption that underlies all human relationships and social contracts: that consciousness and physical form exist in stable, permanent relationship, that the person speaking through familiar features is actually the individual whose history and personality gave meaning to those features in the first place. His technique transforms every interaction into potential deception, every reunion into possible betrayal, every expression of love into a weapon that can be turned against those who offered it in good faith. The technique that allows this systematic desecration of human identity operates through possession of deceased bodies, but the clinical description of this process fails to capture the existential violation that occurs when someone's physical form continues to move and speak and interact with the world while serving purposes that contradict everything that individuals stood for during their authentic existence. The curse that enables this parasitic relationship treats death not as the natural conclusion of individual existence, but as an opportunity for exploitation, transforming the deceased into unwilling accomplices in crimes they would have died to prevent. The historical scope of Kenjaku's manipulations reveals a mind that views human civilization not as the accumulated achievement of countless individuals working across generations to build something greater than themselves, but as raw material to be shaped according to designs that serve no purpose beyond satisfying intellectual curiosity about what happens when entire species are subjected to controlled stress and systematic manipulation. His interventions in pivotal moments throughout history demonstrate understanding of social dynamics so profound that he can predict and influence the behavior of entire populations while remaining completely invisible to those he controls. The body that housed Noritoshi Kamo during the Meiji era represented one of Kenjaku's most successful long-term infiltrations, as his possession of a respected member of one of Jujutsu society's most powerful families provided institutional legitimacy for experiments that violated every ethical principle that governs supernatural research, while establishing precedents that would influence policy and practice for generations. The cursed womb death paintings that resulted from his research represent not just technical achievements, but evidence of systematic violation of human dignity disguised as scientific inquiry. The pregnant women who became unwilling subjects in these experiments were selected not just for their biological suitability but for their social vulnerability. Individuals whose disappearances would not trigger official investigations, while their suffering remained invisible to communities that might otherwise have intervened to protect them. The transformation of pregnancy, normally a symbol of hope and future possibility, into a mechanism for creating abominations that embodied the worst aspects of both human and cursed nature, represents a particular form of cruelty that targets the most fundamental aspects of what it means to create and nurture life. The children who resulted from these forced unions between human women and cursed spirits existed in states of permanent psychological torment, conscious beings caught between incompatible natures, while serving as living proof of concept for techniques that would eventually be deployed on a species-wide scale through the culling game. Their existence as neither fully human nor completely cursed denied them access to the communities and relationships that provide meaning and identity, forcing them into isolation that served Kenjaku's research purposes while ensuring their loyalty through systematic deprivation of alternatives. The institutional protection that Kenjaku enjoyed while conducting these experiments demonstrates how easily respected positions can be exploited to provide cover for activities that would be immediately recognized as monstrous if conducted by individuals without social standing and official authority. The deference shown to established hierarchies prevented questions that might have exposed his activities, while ensuring that victims remained isolated and vulnerable to continued exploitation over extended periods. The body of Kaori Itadori that Kenjaku inhabited represents perhaps his most personally devastating violation, as his possession of Yuji's parent transformed the most intimate and foundational relationship in the protagonist's life into evidence of manipulation that began before birth and continues to shape every aspect of his parent existence. The revelation that maternal love was actually calculated deception designed to produce a vessel suitable for housing. Sukuna adds layers of psychological trauma that no amount of subsequent heroism or achievement can completely heal or resolve. The relationship between Kaori's husband and Kenjaku wearing her face represents a form of rape so profound that existing language proves inadequate to describe its full implications, as every moment of intimacy was actually interaction between a grieving widower and the entity responsible for his beloved's death. Every expression of continued love was actually collaboration with the creature that had stolen everything that made that love meaningful and authentic. The complicity forced on Yuji's father through his inability to recognize that his wife had been replaced transforms him from loving husband into unwitting accomplice in his own psychological destruction. The child who resulted from this union carries genetic and supernatural legacy that connects him not just to his human parent, but to centuries of systematic manipulation and experimentation, making his very existence evidence of planning that treated human reproduction as resource management while transforming familial bonds into mechanisms of control and exploitation. Every aspect of Yuji's extraordinary physical capabilities and spiritual resilience reflects not natural gifts, but careful breeding designed to produce characteristics that would serve Kenjaku's purposes rather than the individual's own welfare and development. The possession of Suguru Geto's corpse represents Kenjaku's most psychologically devastating deployment of his technique, as the violation of this particular body created weapons specifically designed to exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of individuals who had loved and trusted Geto during his authentic existence. The casual appropriation of memories and mannerisms that had been expressions of genuine personality during life transforms them into tools of manipulation that cause maximum psychological damage to those who encounter them. The conversations that Kenjaku conducts while wearing Geto's face represent a form of psychological torture that operates through deliberate confusion between past and present, authentic and artificial, love and manipulation, forcing those who interact with him to simultaneously confront their grief over his loss and their hope for his return, while recognizing that both emotions are being exploited to serve purposes that contradict everything he represented during his actual existence. The technique transforms memory itself into a weapon that inflicts suffering precisely because it had once been a source of comfort and strength. The friends and colleagues who encounter Kenjaku wearing Geto's form find themselves unable to respond appropriately because every possible reaction carries emotional costs that threaten their psychological stability and moral foundation, as violence against the body would constitute desecration of someone they loved, while acceptance of his apparent return would represent collaboration with the entity that murdered him, leaving them trapped in impossible situations where any choice results in complicity with their own victimization. The students who had looked up to Geto as mentor and role model during his authentic existence face additional layers of betrayal as his possessed form speaks with voice and mannerisms they remembered as expressions of wisdom and care, while advocating positions that contradict everything he taught them about the proper relationship between power and responsibility, between strength and service, between individual advancement and collective welfare. The institutional damage caused by Kenjaku's possession of respected figures extends beyond immediate psychological trauma to include systematic undermining of trust in leadership and authority that makes future cooperation and collective action increasingly difficult to achieve, as individuals learn that apparent legitimacy and demonstrated competence provide no guarantee that instructions and guidance are being offered in good faith, rather than as elements of manipulation too complex for ordinary perception to detect or resist. The knowledge that Kenjaku has possessed multiple bodies throughout history creates retrospective paranoia about every historical figure and institutional decision, as the possibility that seemingly natural developments in human civilization were actually orchestrated by a single malevolent intelligence transforms all of recorded history into potential evidence of manipulation rather than authentic human achievement, undermining faith in progress and collective wisdom, while promoting cynicism and isolation as rational responses to social uncertainty. The technique that enables body possession operates according to principles that treat individual identity as illusion rather than reality, suggesting that consciousness and personality are superficial characteristics that can be replicated and replaced without meaningful loss, rather than fundamental aspects of what makes existence worthwhile and morally significant. This philosophical framework reduces human beings to biological machinery that can be operated by any sufficiently skilled technician, while denying the unique value and irreplaceable nature of individual perspective and experience. The memories and skills that Kenjaku absorbs from possessed bodies become tools that he deploys without regard for their original context or meaning, transforming expressions of love and creativity and wisdom into weapons of manipulation that cause suffering precisely because they had once represented the best aspects of human nature rather than its capacity for cruelty and exploitation. The appropriation of positive qualities for negative purposes represents a form of corruption that extends beyond individual violation towards systematic destruction of the values and relationships that make civilization possible. The long-term planning that characterizes Kenjaku's approach to historical manipulation demonstrates understanding of human psychology and social dynamics so comprehensive that he can predict and influence the behavior of entire populations across multiple generations while remaining invisible to those he controls, suggesting that his intelligence operates on scales and according to principles that render normal human cognitive capabilities inadequate for detection or resistance without external assistance and supernatural enhancement. The barriers and binding vows that constrain Kenjaku's activities provide only limited protection against his manipulations, as his understanding of Jujutsu principles and legal frameworks allows him to exploit loopholes and technicalities that render most defensive measures ineffective while providing apparent compliance with rules and restrictions that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of systematic violation that characterizes his entire approach to existence. The relationships that Kenjaku forms while inhabiting possessed bodies reflect complete absence of genuine emotional connection or moral consideration for the welfare of others, as every interaction serves instrumental purposes related to advancing his plans while providing no authentic experience of human connection or mutual care, making him a perfect predator who can mimic the behaviors that create trust and affection while feeling none of the emotions that normally constrain exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The students and followers who interact with Kenjaku during his various possessions find themselves receiving instruction and guidance that appears beneficial while actually serving purposes that will ultimately cause them suffering and destruction, as his teaching methods are designed to create dependency and loyalty that can be exploited rather than genuine development that would enable independent judgment and moral reasoning capable of recognizing and resisting manipulation. The resources and institutional power that Kenjaku accumulates through his various identities are deployed not for any constructive purpose, but as elements of increasingly complex schemes designed to cause maximum disruption and suffering, while satisfying his curiosity about human responses to systematic stress and manipulation, making him a researcher whose subjects are entire civilizations, while his methodology involves techniques that would be immediately recognized as torture if applied to individual victims under controlled conditions. The legacy of trauma and destruction that follows in Kenjaku's wake persists across generations as communities and institutions attempt to recover from manipulations they cannot fully understand or address, creating cycles of suspicion and defensive isolation that prevent the kind of cooperation and mutual support that would be necessary to heal the damage he has inflicted while building resilience against future attacks. The 1,000-year span of his documented activities represents only the visible portion of manipulations that likely extend far deeper into human history than current evidence suggests, implying that many of the tragedies and conflicts that have shaped civilization may have been orchestrated or influenced by an intelligence whose understanding of human nature allows prediction and control of social dynamics across scales that render individual agency and collective wisdom inadequate defenses against systematic predation disguised as natural historical development. The ultimate goal that drives Kenjaku's millennia of manipulation involves forced evolution of the human species through integration with cursed energy, a transformation that would eliminate individual consciousness in favor of collective awareness that he would control and direct according to his own interests and curiosity, making him not just a predator who feeds on human suffering, but an entity whose success would mean the permanent extinction of everything that makes human existence meaningful and valuable. In the blood-soaked annals of human history, where chronicles of war and conquest document humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, no figure looms with more terrifying prominence than the entity that once walked among mortals as a man, before transcending every boundary that separates civilization from primordial savagery to become something so fundamentally opposed to life itself that his very name has become synonymous with absolute malevolence. Ryomen Sukuna represents not merely the most powerful curse in existence, but the disturbing possibility that the greatest monsters emerge not from external forces of darkness, but from the deliberate choice to abandon every quality that makes existence meaningful in favor of pursuing power through methods so horrific that they transform the practitioner into something that can no longer be considered human in any meaningful sense. The origins of the King of Curses begin not in supernatural realms of pure evil, but in the recognizably human ambition of a Jujutsu sorcerer during the golden age of the technique, the Heian era, when practitioners of supernatural arts enjoyed social status and institutional support that allowed them to pursue their abilities without the constraints and secrecy that would later characterize their profession. Sukuna's transformation from protector of human civilization into its greatest threat demonstrates how easily the very power intended to serve others can be corrupted when wielded by individuals who prioritize personal advancement over moral responsibility, creating cautionary tales that echo across centuries while remaining largely unheeded by subsequent generations who believe themselves immune to similar corruption. The historical records that document Sukuna's reign of terror during his human existence paint pictures of systematic brutality that exceeded anything previously recorded in terms of both scope and deliberate cruelty, suggesting that his evolution toward absolute evil was gradual rather than sudden, a process of moral degradation that occurred through countless smaller choices to prioritize power over compassion until the accumulated weight of those decisions transformed him into someone capable of viewing other human beings as nothing more than sources of entertainment and sustenance rather than individuals deserving of basic moral consideration. The cannibalistic practices that characterize Sukuna's approach to consuming both cursed spirits and human flesh represent a fundamental perversion of the natural order that governs survival and growth, transforming the basic biological necessity of nutrition into ritualized violation of the boundaries that separate self from other, predator from prey, sacred from profane. His consumption of human flesh was not driven by hunger or nutritional necessity, but by psychological compulsion to dominate and absorb the essence of his victims in ways that went far beyond mere physical destruction toward complete negation of their existence as independent beings with inherent worth and dignity. The technique development that Sukuna pursued during his human years focused not on protection or healing or any constructive application of supernatural power, but on maximizing his capacity to inflict suffering while prolonging the process of death, to extract maximum psychological benefit from his victims' terror and despair. His cleave and dismantle techniques represent perfect expressions of predatory intelligence applied to the systematic dismantling of living beings, tools designed not for efficient elimination of threats, but for the artistic expression of cruelty that treats other people's pain as raw material for aesthetic achievement. The domain expansion that Sukuna perfected represents perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of his worldview, creating spaces where his will becomes absolute law, while his victims find themselves trapped within environments that exist solely to facilitate their torment and destruction. Malevolent Shrine transforms the concept of sacred space from sanctuary that protects the vulnerable into hunting ground that guarantees the elimination of anything that enters without Sukuna's explicit permission, perverting religious and spiritual symbolism while demonstrating complete contempt for the values and institutions that provide meaning and comfort to ordinary human existence. The four-armed, two-faced form that Sukuna manifested during the height of his power represents not just physical mutation, but symbolic expression of his fundamental opposition to natural order and human limitation, as his additional limbs and faces allowed him to perceive and manipulate his environment in ways that transcended normal categories, while emphasizing his separation from the species that had given him birth. The monstrous appearance that resulted from his transformation served both practical and psychological purposes, providing enhanced combat capabilities while ensuring that his victims understood immediately that they faced something that had abandoned humanity completely in pursuit of absolute power. The political and social chaos that accompanied Sukuna's rise to prominence during the Heian period created conditions that allowed his predatory behavior to flourish without effective opposition, as traditional authorities found themselves unable to coordinate responses to threats that exceeded their institutional capabilities, while ordinary citizens were forced to navigate survival in environments where established social contracts and moral expectations provided no protection against systematic predation disguised as natural selection and evolutionary advancement. The sorcerers who attempted to challenge Sukuna during his reign of terror discovered that traditional approaches to combat and conflict resolution proved inadequate when facing opponents who had abandoned every constraint that normally limited the application of supernatural power, as his willingness to employ methods that other practitioners considered taboo or unthinkable provided tactical advantages that could not be overcome through superior technique or greater dedication to protective principles alone. The transformation from human sorcerer to cursed spirit that occurred upon Sukuna's physical death represents the logical conclusion of choices made throughout his existence, as his complete identification with malevolence and destruction created psychological and spiritual conditions where his consciousness could survive bodily death while retaining all the characteristics that had made him dangerous during life, ensuring that his threat to human civilization would persist across centuries in forms that traditional methods of elimination could not address effectively. The 20 fingers that contained fragments of Sukuna's power after his death became objects of such intense cursed energy that they warped reality in their immediate vicinity while posing existential threats to anyone foolish enough to attempt consuming them, representing not just weapons of mass destruction but psychological warfare devices that exploited human curiosity and ambition to spread his influence across time and space in ways that made his eventual resurrection not just possible but inevitable. The binding and sealing techniques that were employed to contain Sukuna's remains required unprecedented cooperation between rival factions and competing institutions, demonstrating that even sorcerers who could not agree on basic principles of governance and methodology understood that his continued existence posed threats that transcended their individual concerns and disputes, making temporary alliance necessary for species survival rather than mere political convenience. The legends and folklore that developed around Sukuna's historical activities served dual purposes of preserving crucial tactical intelligence about his capabilities, while warning future generations about the psychological and moral dangers that accompanied the pursuit of absolute power, creating cultural antibodies that might provide some protection against similar corruption, while acknowledging that such protection would always be incomplete and conditional on continued vigilance and moral courage. The resurrection that occurred when Yuji Itadori consumed Sukuna's finger represents the activation of plans that had been centuries in development, as the King of Curses had anticipated that eventually someone would be desperate or foolish enough to seek power through association with his remains, providing him with opportunities to influence events while working toward complete restoration of his former capabilities and the resumption of activities that had been interrupted by death rather than genuinely concluded. The psychological dynamic that develops between Sukuna and Yuji within the shared consciousness demonstrates the predatory intelligence that characterizes the King of Curses' approach to all relationships, as every interaction serves purposes related to corruption and control, rather than genuine communication or mutual understanding, making the protagonist's resistance to influence a constant battle that requires not just moral strength but supernatural protection to maintain over extended periods. The moments when Sukuna assumes control of Yuji's body provide glimpses of what his complete resurrection would mean for human civilization, as his casual deployment of overwhelming destructive force demonstrates both his technical capabilities and his complete indifference to collateral damage or civilian casualties, treating mass destruction as entertainment while viewing the suffering he causes as validation of his superiority over beings he considers fundamentally inferior to himself. The contracts and binding vows that Sukuna negotiates with various characters throughout the series reveal tactical thinking that operates according to principles of exploitation and deception rather than honor or mutual benefit, as he consistently interprets agreements in ways that maximize his advantage while providing minimum compliance with their literal terms, demonstrating that his understanding of language and law serves predatory purposes rather than facilitating genuine cooperation or peaceful coexistence. The techniques that Sukuna employs during his limited manifestations in the modern era show continued development and refinement of abilities that were already legendary during his original existence, suggesting that his time as a cursed spirit was spent not in dormancy, but in continued learning and adaptation that enhanced his threat level beyond what historical records might suggest was possible, making contemporary preparation for his resurrection inadequate, regardless of how thoroughly previous encounters had been studied and analyzed. The pleasure that Sukuna derives from causing suffering extends beyond simple sadism towards something approaching aesthetic appreciation, as he treats the orchestration of pain and terror as artistic expression, while viewing his victims' responses as performance pieces that validate his creative vision, transforming systematic cruelty into cultural activity that he pursues for intellectual satisfaction rather than mere emotional gratification. The relationship between Sukuna and other cursed spirits reflects hierarchical thinking that recognizes no legitimate authority beyond his own, while demanding absolute submission from entities that he considers useful and immediate, elimination of those that pose any potential threat to his supremacy, creating social dynamics based purely on power differentials rather than mutual respect or shared purpose, making cooperation with him impossible except on terms that guarantee eventual betrayal and destruction. The knowledge that Sukuna possesses about Jujutsu history and technique development spans centuries of observation and experimentation, providing him with understanding of supernatural principles that exceeds any contemporary practitioner, while informing strategic thinking that accounts for social and technological changes that have occurred during his spiritual existence, making him not just physically dangerous, but intellectually superior to most opponents, in ways that conventional training and preparation cannot address adequately. The corruption that Sukuna's presence brings to any environment extends beyond immediate physical threat towards psychological contamination that affects everyone who encounters evidence of his activities, as exposure to systematic cruelty on the scale that he represents challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral possibility, while promoting cynicism and despair that serve his interests by weakening social bonds and collective resistance to his influence. The anticipation that characterizes Sukuna's attitude toward his eventual complete resurrection reflects confidence based on centuries of observation regarding human nature and social dynamics, as he understands that the very qualities that make people worth protecting also make them vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. by entities willing to abandon moral constraints in pursuit of absolute power, ensuring that his return will find populations unprepared for threats that exceed their conceptual frameworks and defensive capabilities. The legacy of trauma that follows in Sukuna's wake persists across generations as communities attempt to recover from encounters with evil so pure and systematic that existing frameworks for processing, suffering, and loss prove inadequate, creating psychological conditions where healing becomes impossible, while vulnerability to future predation increases through the erosion of social trust and collective resilience that normally provide protection against systematic exploitation and manipulation. The ultimate goal that drives Sukuna's continued existence involves not just personal resurrection, but the transformation of human civilization into hunting ground, where his predatory instincts can be expressed without constraint or opposition, making him not just individual threat, but existential danger to the entire species, whose survival depends on maintaining moral and social frameworks that his very existence contradicts and undermines through demonstration that absolute power requires no justification beyond the capacity to seize and maintain it through whatever means prove most effective. The King of Curses represents the final evolution of human ambition, unrestrained by conscience or consideration for others, a cautionary tale about what becomes possible when individuals choose to pursue power through methods that require the systematic abandonment of everything that makes existence meaningful and valuable, transforming protectors into predators while demonstrating that the greatest monsters are not external forces of darkness, but the deliberate choices made by those who decide that their desires matter more than the welfare of everyone else in existence. Within the shadowed halls of one of Jujutsu society's most prestigious bloodlines, where ancient traditions and accumulated power should have created sanctuaries of wisdom and protection for those blessed with supernatural abilities, there festered instead a culture of systematic dehumanization, so complete and methodical that it transformed the very concept of family from source of love and support into machinery of oppression that consumed its own children while justifying their destruction through appeals to tradition and genetic superiority that masked cruelty behind facades of noble purpose and ancestral honor. The Zenin clan represents perhaps the most disturbing example of how institutional power can be wielded to perpetuate cycles of abuse across generations while maintaining social respectability and political influence within communities that should recognize and intervene against such systematic violation of basic human dignity, demonstrating how easily moral blindness can become embedded within cultural structures when those who benefit from existing hierarchies possess sufficient authority to silence dissent while punishing those who attempt to expose or challenge their methods. The philosophy that governs Zenin family dynamics reduces individual human worth to measurable supernatural capability, while treating those who fail to meet arbitrary standards of power as expendable resources whose suffering serves the greater good of maintaining bloodline purity and competitive advantage within Jujutsu society, creating frameworks that justify any level of cruelty against family members who are deemed genetically or spiritually inadequate, according to criteria that prioritize strength over character, technique over compassion, and compliance over independent thought. The childhood experiences that shaped Maki and Mai Zenin reveal systematic psychological torture disguised as character building, as their family employed emotional manipulation and physical abuse to break down their sense of self-worth while creating dependency relationships that made resistance to authority appear impossible and self-destructive, ensuring that even their attempts to protect each other became sources of additional guilt and trauma that served the clan's interests by preventing unified opposition to their treatment. The training regimens that characterized their upbringing were designed not to develop their natural abilities in ways that would promote psychological health and spiritual growth, but to create perfect compliance with family expectations, while eliminating any traces of independent will or moral judgment that might interfere with their deployment as tools in service of clan objectives that prioritized institutional advancement over individual welfare or authentic human development. The social isolation that was imposed upon the twins from early childhood prevented them from developing external relationships that might have provided alternative perspectives on their family's treatment, while ensuring that their understanding of normal human interaction remained distorted by exposure to systematic manipulation and conditional affection that was withdrawn whenever their behavior failed to conform to clan expectations regarding appropriate roles for women within their hierarchical structure. The differential treatment that Mai received as someone with measurable cursed energy, while Maki faced rejection for her apparent lack of supernatural ability, created artificial competition between sisters who should have been natural allies, while demonstrating how easily family bonds could be weaponized to serve institutional purposes that required division and suspicion among those who might otherwise unite against their oppressors through mutual support and shared resistance. The psychological conditioning that convinced Mai to accept her role as compliant family member while resenting Maki for pursuing independence illustrates how effectively abusive systems can manipulate victims into identifying with their oppressors while directing anger toward those who attempt escape rather than toward the authorities responsible for creating conditions that make escape necessary for psychological survival and moral development. The clan's treatment of Toji Fushiguro before his departure demonstrates how their abuse extended beyond immediate family members toward anyone whose existence challenged their fundamental assumptions about the relationship between supernatural power and human worth, as his complete lack of cursed energy should have made him worthless according to their value system, yet his physical capabilities threatened their conceptual frameworks in ways that required his elimination from family structures through systematic humiliation and eventual abandonment. The marriage arrangements that the clan imposed upon their female members represent institutionalized trafficking, disguised as traditional matchmaking, as women were treated as breeding stock whose primary value lay in their potential to produce offspring with desirable supernatural characteristics, rather than as individuals with inherent worth and autonomous decision-making capacity regarding their own futures and relationships, creating systems that reduced human reproduction to livestock management while maintaining facades of respectability and cultural continuity. The economic resources that the clan controlled provided leverage for maintaining their abusive practices while preventing victims from seeking external assistance or alternative living arrangements, as financial dependency created additional barriers to escape, while ensuring that even adult family members remained subject to patriarchal authority that could withdraw material support as punishment for any behavior that challenged established hierarchies or questioned institutional methods and objectives. The political alliances that the Zenin family maintained within Jujutsu society created networks of mutual protection among abusive institutions, while ensuring that complaints or accusations against clan leadership would be dismissed or suppressed by authorities who benefited from existing power structures and therefore had personal interests in preventing exposure of systematic abuse that might call their own practices into question and threaten their positions within established hierarchies. The religious and philosophical justifications that clan elders employed to rationalize their treatment of family members drew upon centuries of accumulated tradition, while selectively interpreting historical precedents in ways that supported current practices, without acknowledging how social conditions and moral understanding had evolved in directions that made such practices increasingly recognizable as violations of basic human dignity, rather than necessary elements of effective institutional management and character development. The competition that was fostered among younger family members created artificial scarcity regarding parental approval and institutional recognition, while ensuring that siblings viewed each other as threats rather than potential sources of support and alliance, preventing the kind of collective organization that might have challenged adult authority while maintaining systems that required constant vigilance to prevent unified resistance from developing among those who shared similar experiences of systematic abuse and dehumanization. The educational approaches that characterized Zen child rearing emphasized technical skill development, while systematically neglecting emotional intelligence and moral reasoning, creating individuals who could perform their assigned roles within clan hierarchies while remaining incapable of recognizing or resisting manipulation, ensuring that each generation would perpetuate the same patterns of abuse while believing themselves to be preserving valuable traditions rather than maintaining systems of systematic oppression. The gender dynamics that governed family relationships reflected broader cultural prejudices while being intensified by the clan's obsession with supernatural power and genetic inheritance, creating environments where women faced double discrimination based on both their sex and their measured cursed energy output, while being denied opportunities for advancement or recognition regardless of their actual capabilities and contributions to family welfare and institutional success. The succession planning that dominated clan leadership decisions prioritized male heirs with strong curse techniques while systematically excluding or marginalizing family members who possessed different forms of intelligence or capability, creating narrow definitions of acceptable leadership that perpetuated existing power structures while preventing innovation or adaptation that might have addressed changing social conditions and evolving threats to clan survival and relevance. The disciplinary methods that were employed to maintain order within family hierarchies relied heavily on public humiliation and social ostracism rather than constructive guidance or education, creating psychological environments where fear of embarrassment became more powerful motivation than genuine respect for authority or commitment to shared values and objectives, ensuring compliance through terror rather than inspiring dedication through positive reinforcement and meaningful recognition. The housing arrangements that segregated family members according to their status within clan hierarchies created physical environments that reinforced psychological barriers while ensuring that those in positions of authority remained insulated from direct exposure to the suffering they caused, making it easier to maintain abusive practices when their consequences remained largely invisible to those responsible for implementing and justifying them through appeals to tradition and necessity. The communication patterns that characterized family interactions discouraged honest expression of thoughts and feelings, while rewarding deception and manipulation as necessary survival skills, creating social environments where authenticity became dangerous while conformity to expected roles provided the only reliable path to avoiding punishment, ensuring that family members learned to hide their true selves while performing versions of personality that served institutional purposes rather than expressing genuine individual identity and autonomous moral judgment. The healthcare and psychological support that should have been available to family members experiencing trauma or distress was either completely absent or controlled by clan authorities who viewed emotional problems as evidence of weakness rather than natural responses to systematic abuse. preventing healing while ensuring that psychological damage would accumulate over time until it either broke victims completely or motivated them toward desperate attempts at escape that could be punished as betrayal of family loyalty and institutional obligation. The career guidance that was provided to younger family members reflected clan priorities rather than individual interests or aptitudes, forcing people into roles that served institutional needs, while ignoring personal preferences and natural talents that might have led to greater satisfaction and more effective contribution to both family welfare and broader social good, creating lives of frustration and resentment that fed cycles of abuse while preventing the kind of personal fulfillment that might have motivated positive change within clan structures. The documentation and record-keeping that tracked family member behavior and achievement created permanent files that could be used to justify continued punishment or exclusion long after specific incidents had been resolved, ensuring that mistakes or acts of rebellion would continue to affect treatment and opportunities indefinitely, while preventing the kind of forgiveness and redemption that healthy family relationships require for maintaining bonds across 4 generations and through periods of conflict and disagreement. The social events and public appearances that the clan organized served primarily as demonstrations of power and status, rather than opportunities for genuine celebration or community building, creating performative environments where family members were required to display happiness and loyalty, regardless of their actual feelings, while maintaining facades that concealed systematic abuse from external observers who might otherwise recognize and intervene against their treatment. The ultimate horror of the Zenin clan system lies not in any single act of cruelty, but in its complete normalization of dehumanization as acceptable family practice, creating environments where children grow up believing that love must be earned through compliance, while punishment represents natural consequence of inadequacy rather than choice made by adults who could select different approaches to child rearing and family management, but prefer methods that maintain their authority through fear rather than respect, ensuring that cycles of abuse continue across generations, while being disguised as preservation of valuable cultural traditions that actually serve no purpose, beyond perpetuating suffering that could be eliminated through recognition that human worth exists, independent of supernatural capability or institutional utility, within the sterile corridors of institutional authority where ancient traditions masquerade as divine mandate. No single practice reveals the fundamental corruption of Jujutsu society more clearly than the systematic sacrifice of children whose only crime was being born with spiritual characteristics that made them suitable vessels for immortal entities whose continued existence required the regular consumption of young lives to maintain barriers that protected civilization while demanding prices that civilized people should never be willing to pay through the deliberate murder of innocents whose deaths were celebrated as noble sacrifice rather than recognized as evidence of moral bankruptcy, disguised as necessary pragmatism. The Star Plasma Vessel program represents the institutionalization of child sacrifice on a scale and with a level of bureaucratic organization that transforms individual tragedy into systematic atrocity, creating governmental and religious structures whose primary function involves identifying children with appropriate spiritual characteristics before subjecting them to psychological conditioning designed to make them compliant participants in their own execution, while ensuring that their deaths serve ceremonial purposes that validate the authority and wisdom of adults who have chosen murder as their preferred solution to problems that might be addressed through methods that do not require the deliberate ending of young lives. Riko Amanai's designation as the chosen vessel occurred not through voluntary application or informed consent, but through genetic lottery that condemned her to death before she possessed the cognitive capacity to understand what her selection meant, transforming her from individual human being with inherent worth and unlimited potential into religious artifact whose value lay entirely in her willingness to die at the appointed time for purposes she had no role in establishing and objectives she would never live to see fulfilled, making her entire existence subordinate to institutional needs that treated her personal hopes and dreams as irrelevant complications to be managed rather than fundamental aspects of human dignity that should be protected and nurtured, regardless of their utility to established authority. The educational system that was constructed around Riko's unique circumstances operated according to principles that prioritized psychological manipulation over intellectual development, ensuring that her understanding of her role and destiny remained limited to frameworks that promoted acceptance of her fate, while preventing the kind of critical thinking that might lead to questioning the moral legitimacy of systems that demanded child sacrifice as the price of continued social stability and supernatural protection, creating pedagogical environments designed to produce compliance rather than wisdom. The social isolation that characterized Riko's upbringing served multiple institutional purposes, preventing her from developing relationships outside controlled parameters, while ensuring that her emotional attachments remained focused on individuals who were committed to facilitating her death rather than protecting her life, creating dependency patterns that made resistance to her predetermined fate appear selfish and destructive, rather than natural and appropriate response to systematic violation of her fundamental right to continued existence and autonomous decision-making regarding her own future. The timeline that governed Riko's approach toward assimilation was calculated to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing opportunities for external intervention or personal reflection that might lead to rejection of her assigned role, creating artificial urgency that prevented careful consideration of alternatives, while ensuring that any hesitation or reluctance could be dismissed as temporary weakness, rather than legitimate moral concern about participating in systems that required her death as validation of their effectiveness and necessity. The cultural narratives that were employed to justify Riko's sacrifice drew upon centuries of accumulated tradition, while selectively emphasizing themes of noble service and necessary duty that obscured the fundamental reality that her death represented institutional failure to develop protective methods that did not require murder of innocents, transforming child sacrifice into heroic act, rather than recognizing it as evidence of moral and intellectual bankruptcy among authorities who possessed sufficient power to demand better solutions, but preferred approaches that transferred costs to those least capable of resistance or escape. The religious framework that provided ideological support for the Star Plasma Vessel program treated Tengen's immortality as divine blessing rather than supernatural parasitism, creating theological justifications for child sacrifice that appealed to concepts of higher purpose and cosmic necessity, while ignoring questions about whether immortal entities who required regular consumption of human lives deserved protection regardless of the services they provided to broader populations who remained unaware of the prices being paid on their behalf through systematic murder of designated victims. The institutional structures that administered the vessel selection and preparation process operated with bureaucratic efficiency that transformed moral atrocity into administrative routine, creating governmental mechanisms that could identify, process, and deliver child sacrifices with the same professional competence that characterized other public services, while maintaining facades of legitimacy and social responsibility that concealed the fundamentally criminal nature of their characterized other public services. Activities from populations who might otherwise demand accountability and reform. The psychological conditioning that Riko underwent during her preparation was designed to make her grateful for the opportunity to serve, rather than resentful of her selection, employing techniques of emotional manipulation that convinced her that her death represented the highest form of human achievement, while obscuring the reality that her sacrifice primarily benefited authorities who gained continued access to Tengen's protective services without paying personal costs or accepting individual risks that might motivate them toward developing alternative solutions that did not require systematic murder of innocents. The security arrangements that surrounded Riko during her final days were ostensibly designed to protect her from external threats, while actually serving to prevent escape or rescue attempts that might interfere with institutional plans for her death, creating protective environments that functioned as sophisticated prisons designed to ensure that their occupant remained available for execution at the appointed time, regardless of any changes in personal perspective or external circumstances that might otherwise provide opportunities for survival. The adults who were assigned responsibility for Riko's welfare and protection found themselves caught in institutional systems that defined success as facilitating her death rather than preserving her life, creating professional and moral conflicts that were resolved through psychological defense mechanisms that allowed them to reframe child murder as noble service, while suppressing awareness of their complicity in systematic violation of fundamental human rights and basic moral principles that should govern relationships between adults and children under their care. The friendship that Riko maintained with her school companion represented one of the few authentic human relationships in her life that was not structured around institutional objectives related to her eventual sacrifice, providing glimpses of normal adolescent experience that emphasized everything she was being forced to abandon through participation in systems that treated her personal desires and social connections as obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be protected and honored through whatever means proved necessary. The final conversations that Riko had with her designated protectors revealed her understanding that the adults responsible for her safety were actually committed to ensuring her death, creating psychological situations where her attempts to process her approaching execution were complicated by recognition that those who claimed to care about her welfare were actually invested in preventing her survival, transforming trust relationships into sources of additional trauma and confusion that made her final days more psychologically difficult than they needed to be. The moments when Riko experienced ordinary teenage pleasures and activities during her final week took on tragic significance because of institutional decisions that had predetermined their brevity, creating situations where natural human experiences became evidence of everything that child sacrifice systems destroyed through their systematic reduction of individual human worth to utilitarian calculations that prioritized abstract, institutional objectives over concrete personal welfare and authentic human flourishing that required continued existence for meaningful expression. The attempted rescue efforts that were mounted by individuals who recognized the moral illegitimacy of Riko's scheduled execution faced opposition not just from external enemies, but from institutional authorities who viewed her survival as threat to established systems rather than triumph of human decency over bureaucratic murder, demonstrating how easily governmental and religious structures could transform child protection into institutional betrayal, when their fundamental operations required regular sacrifice of innocence as validation of their authority and effectiveness. The public response to Riko's eventual murder revealed the depth of moral corruption that characterized broader Jujutsu society, as authorities who should have recognized her death as institutional failure instead celebrated it as necessary sacrifice, while populations who should have demanded accountability and reform instead accepted official narratives that portrayed systematic child murder as unfortunate but unavoidable element of maintaining social stability and supernatural protection that justified any level of cruelty toward designated victims. The grief and trauma that affected individuals who had developed genuine emotional connections with Riko during her brief life created lasting psychological damage that persisted long after her death, while serving as evidence of the human costs that child sacrifice systems imposed not just on their primary victims but on everyone who possessed sufficient moral sensitivity to recognize the fundamental wrongness of institutional practices that demanded murder of innocents as price of continued operation and social legitimacy. The systemic factors that made Riko's sacrifice appear necessary rather than optional reflected deeper failures of imagination and moral courage among authorities who possessed sufficient power and resources to develop alternative, protective methods, but preferred solutions that transferred costs to those least capable of resistance, while maintaining existing hierarchies and operational procedures that benefited established interests at expense of vulnerable populations who had no voice in institutional decision-making processes that determined their fate. The precedents that were established through Riko's successful sacrifice created frameworks that would facilitate future child murders, while making resistance to such practices appear unreasonable and antisocial rather than morally necessary and psychologically healthy response to systematic violation of basic human rights, ensuring that institutional child sacrifice would continue indefinitely unless external forces intervened to break cycles of violence that had been normalized through appeals to tradition and necessity that masked moral cowardice behind facades of practical wisdom. The long-term consequences of the Star Plasma Vessel program extended beyond individual tragedy towards systematic corruption of entire institutions and professional communities, whose operations became dependent on regular access to child victims, creating organizational cultures that treated murder of innocents as normal aspect of their work, while developing psychological defense mechanisms that allowed participants to suppress awareness of their complicity in systematic atrocity that violated every principle of human decency and moral reasoning that should govern civilized society. The ultimate horror of Riko's story lies not in her individual death, but in the institutional systems that made her murder appear inevitable while preventing recognition that child sacrifice represents moral failure rather than necessary evil, creating social conditions where systematic violation of fundamental human rights could be disguised as noble service, while authorities, who should protect vulnerable populations, instead participated in their systematic exploitation and eventual elimination for purposes that could be achieved through methods that did not require deliberate murder of innocents, whose only crime was possessing characteristics that made them useful to entities whose immortality came at prices that no civilized society should be willing to pay, through sacrifice of its own children. In the pantheon of supernatural malevolence that haunts the hidden world of Jujutsu sorcery, no entity embodies pure violation of human dignity more completely than the curse that emerged from humanity's accumulated disgust and self-hatred, manifesting as a being whose very existence represents the ultimate perversion of what it means to possess consciousness and agency in a world where identity should remain sacred and inviolable. Mahito stands as perhaps the most psychologically disturbing antagonist in the entire spectrum of cursed spirits. not because of his raw, destructive power, though that proves formidable enough, but because his technique operates by attacking the fundamental core of what makes individuals human, transforming the soul itself from sanctuary of personal identity into raw material, to be reshaped according to whims that reflect no purpose beyond sadistic curiosity about how much suffering consciousness can endure before collapsing. Entirely, the curse technique that defines Mahito's approach to existence allows him to perceive and manipulate human souls with the casual ease that others might demonstrate when working with clay or paint, treating the essential core of individual identity as malleable substance that can be twisted and reformed according to his aesthetic preferences, while completely disregarding the psychological and physical agony that such transformation inflicts upon his victims, who remain conscious throughout processes that violate every assumption about the stability and permanence of selfhood that normally provides foundation for psychological security and social interaction. The philosophical implications of Mahito's abilities extend far beyond immediate tactical concerns toward existential questions about the nature of human identity and consciousness, as his technique demonstrates that what people consider their most fundamental and unchangeable characteristics are actually vulnerable to external manipulation by entities that possess sufficient power and complete absence of moral restraint, transforming every aspect of personal identity from permanent feature into temporary arrangement that can be altered or eliminated according to the whims of predators who view human suffering as entertainment rather than tragedy. The victims who survive encounters with Mahito's soul manipulation carry psychological and physical scars that transcend normal categories of trauma, because their experiences involved not just pain or loss, but fundamental alteration of their essential being in ways that make recovery impossible through conventional therapeutic approaches, as healing requires restoration of damaged systems, while Mahito's technique creates damage that cannot be undone because it involves rewriting rather than merely injuring the basic code that defines individual existence and personal identity. The grotesque transformations that Mahito inflicts upon his experimental subjects represent artistic expression of his contempt for human form and dignity, creating living sculptures that embody the complete negation of everything that makes existence meaningful, while ensuring that his victims remain conscious enough to experience the horror of their new circumstances without retaining sufficient agency to seek relief through death or escape, trapping them in states of being that exist purely to demonstrate his power over fundamental aspects of reality that should remain beyond the reach of external manipulation. The childlike curiosity that characterizes Mahito's approach to human experimentation makes his cruelty particularly disturbing because it reflects not sadistic pleasure derived from causing pain, though he certainly experiences that, but genuine intellectual interest in exploring the boundaries of what consciousness can endure when subjected to systematic violation of every assumption about identity and selfhood that normally provides psychological stability and social functionality, making his victims subjects in research projects that have no purpose beyond satisfying his desire to understand how much suffering he can create. The casual manner in which Mahito discusses his activities and objectives reveals complete absence of empathy or moral consideration for the welfare of others, as he treats human beings not as individuals deserving of respect and protection, but as raw material for experiments that serve his personal entertainment, while providing opportunities to explore technical possibilities that exist at the intersection of supernatural power and systematic cruelty, making every interaction with him a potential source of existential threat that extends far beyond physical danger toward complete annihilation of personal identity. The psychological manipulation that Mahito employs alongside his physical techniques demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human emotional vulnerabilities that allows him to exploit love, friendship, and compassion as weapons against those who possess such feelings, turning positive emotions into sources of additional suffering while ensuring that his victims understand that their capacity for caring about others makes them more, rather than less, vulnerable to his particular form of predation, creating tactical advantages that reward moral sensitivity with increased exposure to psychological torture. The relationship that develops between Mahito and Junpei Yoshino represents perhaps the most disturbing example of how curses can exploit human vulnerability and social isolation to create willing collaborators in their own destruction. As the teenager's experiences with bullying and social rejection created psychological conditions where Mahito's friendship appeared genuine, while his promises of power and belonging provided alternatives to continued suffering that seemed more attractive than resistance to manipulation that might otherwise have been recognized and rejected by someone with access to healthy relationships and social support. The corruption process that transforms Junpei from victim to potential accomplice demonstrates how systematically applied psychological pressure can override moral intuition and social conditioning when applied by entities that understand human nature well enough to identify and exploit specific individual vulnerabilities, while providing apparent solutions to personal problems that mask longer-term consequences, until escape becomes impossible and complicity appears to be the only alternative to complete destruction of identity and social connection. The technical precision that Mahito demonstrates when reshaping human souls reveals understanding of consciousness and identity that exceeds anything achieved by legitimate researchers, suggesting that his knowledge comes not from academic study but from extensive experimentation on living subjects whose suffering provided educational opportunities that allowed him to refine his techniques while developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to violation of human dignity that transcend simple physical torture toward complete reconstruction of fundamental selfhood, according to principles that serve no purpose beyond artistic expression of absolute contempt for everything that makes existence meaningful. The domain expansion that Mahito eventually develops represents the ultimate expression of his worldview, creating spaces where his authority over souls becomes absolute, while his victims find themselves trapped within environments that exist solely to facilitate their transformation into whatever forms best serve his experimental objectives and aesthetic preferences, making escape impossible while ensuring that every moment spent within his domain brings additional violation of personal identity and autonomous agency that had previously provided foundation for psychological stability and social functionality. The allies and followers that Mahito attracts during his activities reflect the capacity of systematic evil to draw support from individuals who have abandoned moral consideration in favor of personal advantage, creating networks of cooperation that facilitate larger-scale atrocities while distributing responsibility in ways that make individual accountability more difficult to establish and maintain, ensuring that his influence extends beyond his personal capabilities toward institutional systems that can perpetuate his methods even after his individual threat has been eliminated. The government and institutional responses to Mahito's activities reveal the inadequacy of conventional approaches to addressing threats that operate outside normal categories of criminal behavior, as legal and social frameworks designed to handle human evil prove insufficient when confronting supernatural entities whose capabilities transcend existing assumptions about what forms of violation are possible and what protective measures might prove effective against predators that can attack the fundamental essence of individual identity rather than merely causing physical harm or material loss. The psychological impact that Mahito's existence has on the broader Jujutsu community extends beyond immediate concern for personal safety toward existential anxiety about the stability of identity and consciousness themselves, as knowledge that souls can be manipulated and transformed challenges basic assumptions about the permanence and inviolability of selfhood that provide foundation for all human relationships and social institutions, creating communities of individuals who must function despite awareness that their most fundamental characteristics might be altered or eliminated by entities whose power exceeds their moral development. The civilians who become aware of Mahito's activities through direct encounter or institutional disclosure find themselves confronting evidence that reality operates according to principles far more dangerous and unpredictable than their education and experience had prepared them to understand, creating psychological crises that cannot be resolved through conventional therapeutic approaches because they involve recognition of genuine threats to the stability of consciousness and identity that exceed normal categories of anxiety and paranoia while demanding practical responses that ordinary people lack resources to implement effectively. The children who witness or experience Mahito's transformative techniques suffer psychological trauma that persists throughout their development because their encounters occurred during formative periods when basic assumptions about reality and safety were still being established, creating foundational damage to worldview and social trust that affects every subsequent relationship and decision, while providing no framework for processing experiences that exceed normal categories of childhood adversity. Institutional support systems designed to address more conventional forms of abuse and neglect. The medical and psychological professionals who attempt to treat survivors of Mahito's activities discover that conventional therapeutic approaches prove inadequate because the trauma their patients experienced involved not just psychological harm but actual alteration of fundamental identity in ways that make restoration of previous functioning impossible while requiring development of entirely new approaches to healing that account for damage to aspects of selfhood that traditional medicine and psychology assume remain stable and unchangeable throughout individual development and social interaction. The families and communities that attempt to support survivors of soul manipulation find themselves confronting evidence that their loved ones have been permanently altered in ways that make previous relationships impossible to maintain, creating grief processes that cannot be completed because the individuals they mourn continue to exist while being fundamentally different from their previous selves, requiring acceptance of loss that cannot be processed through normal frameworks for coping with death or injury because the victims remain physically present while being psychologically unreachable. The broader implications of Mahito's existence extend beyond immediate threat toward questions about the fundamental nature of human consciousness and identity, as his abilities demonstrate that characteristics people consider essential and unchangeable aspects of selfhood are actually vulnerable to external manipulation by entities that possess sufficient power and complete absence of moral constraint, challenging basic assumptions about personal autonomy and individual agency that provide foundation for all ethical reasoning and social organization in civilized communities. The legacy of fear and uncertainty that persists long after Mahito's elimination continues to affect individuals and communities that became aware of his capabilities, as knowledge that souls can be manipulated creates ongoing anxiety about the stability of identity and consciousness that cannot be resolved through conventional reassurance or protective measures, requiring fundamental changes in how people understand themselves and their relationships with others, while developing new frameworks for processing existential threats that exceed previous categories of danger and protective response. The ultimate horror of Mahito's existence lies not in any specific act of cruelty, but in his demonstration that human consciousness and identity, the very foundations upon which all meaning and value rest, are vulnerable to violation by entities that treat personal dignity and individual agency as obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be respected and protected, making every person who becomes aware of his capabilities a potential victim whose sense of security and selfhood can never be completely restored to previous levels of confidence and stability. The summer of 2006 began with the deceptive tranquility that often precedes catastrophic events, when young people blessed with extraordinary abilities moved through their daily routines with the casual confidence that comes from believing that training and preparation can provide adequate protection against any threat the world might arrange for their encounter, unaware that they were about to face challenges that would reveal the fundamental inadequacy of institutional education when measured against the reality of systematic evil wielded by adults who had abandoned every moral constraint in pursuit of objectives that required the destruction of innocence as validation of their tactical superiority and philosophical commitment to predation as natural law. The hidden inventory mission that would destroy the psychological foundations upon which an entire generation of Jujutsu sorcerers had built their understanding of duty and service began as routine assignment that appeared well within the maze capabilities of Tokyo Jujutsu High's most promising students, creating false confidence about their readiness to handle adult responsibilities, while concealing the true nature of challenges that would test not just their technical abilities, but their capacity to maintain moral clarity and emotional stability when confronted with evidence that the world they were sworn to protect contained levels of cruelty and indifference that exceeded every assumption they had developed about human nature and institutional purpose. The transformation of Satoru Gojo and Suguru Geto from idealistic teenagers into traumatized survivors would occur over a period of days that compressed years of psychological development into experiences so intense and morally complex that they challenged every framework for understanding right and wrong that their education had provided, forcing rapid adaptation to realities that their instructors had failed to prepare them for, while ensuring that their emotional responses to systematic betrayal and institutional failure would shape every subsequent decision they made throughout their adult careers as professional sorcerers tasked with protecting populations that had demonstrated their unworthiness of such sacrifice. The assignment of 17-year-old students to protect the star plasma vessel represented institutional negligence disguised as confidence in their abilities, as adult authorities who understood the political complexities and psychological demands that such missions entailed chose to expose young people to trauma that could have been avoided through deployment of experienced professionals who possessed both the technical capabilities and emotional maturity necessary to handle situations where success required not just combat effectiveness, but sophisticated understanding of how to maintain moral clarity when surrounded by evidence of systematic human failure and institutional corruption. The initial briefing that Yaga provided to his students emphasized tactical considerations and technical requirements, while completely failing to address the psychological challenges they would face when forced to befriend someone whose death they were assigned to facilitate, creating preparation that was adequate for combat scenarios, but completely insufficient for the emotional demands of forming genuine human connections with individuals whose sacrifice served institutional purposes that the students had never been asked to evaluate or endorse through informed consent and autonomous moral reasoning. The first encounter between Gojo, Geto, and Riko Amanai revealed the fundamental cruelty of assigning children to manage situations that required adult wisdom and emotional maturity, as their natural empathy and desire to provide comfort created bonds that would make her eventual death a source of personal trauma rather than professional disappointment, transforming what should have been routine protective assignment into emotionally devastating experience that would affect their psychological development and moral reasoning throughout their adult lives and careers. The friendship that developed between the three teenagers during their brief time together represented one of the few authentic human relationships that Riko would experience during her final weeks, providing her with glimpses of normal adolescent interaction that emphasized everything she was being forced to abandon, while creating emotional attachments that made her approaching death more rather than less psychologically difficult for everyone involved, demonstrating how easily institutional objectives could conflict with basic human decency and compassionate response to individual suffering. The security failures that allowed Toji Fushiguro to infiltrate their protective perimeter reflected not just tactical inadequacy, but systematic underestimation of the lengths to which hostile forces would go to prevent Riko's assimilation, as adult authorities failed to anticipate that their enemies possessed both the resources and moral flexibility necessary to employ methods that exceeded conventional categories of acceptable behavior, while targeting vulnerabilities that idealistic young people could not recognize or defend against, effectively without abandoning the very principles that made them worthy of trust and institutional support. The psychological pressure that mounted throughout the mission as external threats became increasingly sophisticated and persistent created stress levels that exceeded anything the students had experienced during their training, forcing them to make tactical and moral decisions without adequate time for reflection or consultation with experienced mentors who might have provided guidance about how to balance competing obligations and ethical considerations when perfect solutions proved impossible, and every available choice carried unacceptable costs in terms of personal integrity and institutional objectives. The moments when Gojo and Geto were forced to choose between protecting Riko and eliminating threats to civilian populations revealed the inadequacy of their moral education, as their training had emphasized technical proficiency without providing frameworks for resolving conflicts between competing ethical obligations that adult sorcerers faced regularly throughout their careers, leaving them unprepared for situations where success required sacrificing some values to preserve others, while maintaining psychological stability and commitment to protective service, despite evidence of systematic institutional failure. The infiltration of Jujutsu High by hostile forces demonstrated that even the most secure institutional environments could be compromised by enemies who possessed sufficient resources and strategic patience, creating psychological uncertainty about the reliability of adult protection and institutional competence that would persist throughout their subsequent development, while affecting their willingness to trust authority figures and established procedures when facing future challenges that exceeded their individual capabilities and required collective coordination and mutual support. The betrayal that occurred when supposedly secure locations proved vulnerable to assault by enemies who had been planning their attack for extended periods revealed that adult authorities had either failed to understand the true scope of threats facing their students or had chosen to expose young people to dangers that they understood but considered acceptable risks, for achieving institutional objectives that prioritized abstract goals over individual welfare and psychological development, creating lasting damage to trust relationships between students and faculty that would affect their future cooperation and professional development. The combat that erupted throughout the school grounds forced students who had trained primarily in controlled environments to adapt rapidly to life or death situations where their mistakes would have permanent consequences for themselves and innocent bystanders, creating pressure that accelerated their psychological development in ways that bypassed normal processes of gradual maturation and careful guidance, leaving them with adult responsibilities and traumatic memories without corresponding increases in wisdom or emotional resources necessary for processing such experiences constructively. The failure of institutional backup and emergency response systems when students faced threats that exceeded their training and preparation demonstrated that adult authorities had either overestimated their students' capabilities or underestimated the dangers they would encounter, creating situations where young people were forced to handle crises that should have triggered immediate intervention by experienced professionals, while learning through direct experience that institutional promises of support and protection could not be relied upon when circumstances exceeded normal parameters. The death of Riko Amanai represented not just mission failure, but the complete collapse of every assumption that had motivated the students' participation in protective service, as her murder demonstrated that their efforts and sacrifice could be rendered meaningless by enemies who possessed superior planning and moral flexibility, while serving no constructive purpose beyond satisfying adult authorities who had initiated the entire sequence of events without adequately considering or preparing for the psychological costs that failure would impose on young people who had trusted their judgment and commitment to student welfare. The aftermath of Riko's assassination forced Gojo and Geto to confront the reality that their protective efforts had been inadequate, not because of personal failure or insufficient training, but because the institutional systems that deployed them were fundamentally flawed, operating according to principles that treated student trauma as acceptable cost of maintaining adult authority and established procedures, while providing no framework for processing grief and moral injury that resulted from participation in missions that required psychological resources that adolescents could not be expected to possess or develop without extensive preparation and ongoing support. The public response to Riko's death revealed the depth of moral corruption that characterized broader society, as civilian populations who should have recognized her sacrifice as tragedy instead celebrated her murder as liberation from institutional oppression they had never been asked to endure, demonstrating that the people's students were trained to protect possessed levels of ingratitude and callousness that made their protective service appear pointless, while providing no psychological reward or social recognition that might compensate for the personal costs of maintaining commitment to public welfare. The psychological isolation that followed their traumatic experiences occurred because adult authorities failed to provide adequate counseling or therapeutic support for students who had been exposed to violence and moral complexity that exceeded their developmental readiness, leaving them to process their experiences independently while maintaining performance standards and institutional obligations that prevented honest expression of their emotional distress and growing doubts about the legitimacy and effectiveness of the systems they served. The philosophical questions that emerged from their experiences challenged every assumption about the relationship between power and responsibility that had motivated their entry into Jujutsu education, as they discovered that superior abilities created obligations to protect people who were not only ungrateful for such protection, but actively hostile toward those who provided it, while institutional authorities remained committed to methods and objectives that prioritized abstract principles over individual welfare and authentic human development. The divergent responses that Gojo and Geto developed to their shared trauma demonstrated how identical experiences could produce opposite conclusions depending on individual psychology and moral framework, as Gojo's evolution toward detached professionalism contrasted with Geto's progression toward ideological extremism, while both responses reflected damage to their capacity for genuine human connection and authentic emotional expression that would affect every subsequent relationship and professional decision throughout their adult careers. The long-term consequences of the hidden inventory mission extended far beyond individual psychological damage towards systematic changes in how Jujutsu society operated and understood its relationship with civilian populations, as the trauma experienced by an entire generation of students created professional communities characterized by cynicism and emotional numbness, rather than idealistic commitment to protective service, ensuring that future generations would inherit institutions shaped by unprocessed grief and moral injury, rather than wisdom and compassionate dedication to human welfare. The recognition that adult authorities had failed to protect their students from preventable trauma while maintaining systems that would inevitably produce similar casualties in future missions created lasting damage to institutional legitimacy and professional relationships that persisted across generations. As students learned that their welfare was subordinate to abstract objectives and established procedures that served adult interests, rather than promoting genuine human development and authentic moral reasoning based on direct experience, with ethical complexity and individual responsibility. The ultimate tragedy of the hidden inventory arc lies not in any specific event, but in its demonstration that institutional systems designed to prepare young people for adult responsibilities can systematically fail to provide the psychological resources and moral guidance necessary for processing experiences that exceed normal developmental parameters, creating professional communities characterized by unprocessed trauma and defensive isolation rather than wisdom and compassionate effectiveness that would serve both individual welfare and collective objectives through methods that honored human dignity while achieving practical results. The night of October 31st, 2018, descended upon the neon-lit canyons of Shibuya with the deceptive promise of harmless celebration as costumed revelers filled the streets in mockery of monsters and ghouls that existed only in imagination, blissfully unaware that they were about to become unwilling participants in a massacre so carefully orchestrated that their very presence served as both weapon and shield in a supernatural war that would transform their festival of pretend horror into genuine nightmare that claimed not just their lives but their fundamental understanding of reality itself, leaving survivors to grapple with the knowledge that the world they thought they knew was built upon foundations of systematic deception and institutionalized violence that made their previous concerns and anxieties seem tragically insignificant by comparison. The curtain that descended over the district at precisely 7:29 in the evening represented not just a barrier technique of unprecedented scope and sophistication, but the culmination of strategic planning that had anticipated and accounted for every variable that might interfere with the systematic destruction of everything that had provided stability and protection to both the hidden world of Jujutsu sorcery and the civilian population whose ignorance of supernatural threats had been maintained through the vigilant sacrifice of individuals whose efforts would be rendered meaningless by the events that would unfold throughout the following hours. The civilians trapped within Shibuya Station found themselves transformed from ordinary commuters and weekend revelers into human shields, whose lives became tactical assets to be deployed against the very people sworn to protect them, creating moral paradoxes that paralyzed defensive responses while ensuring that every attempt to eliminate hostile curses would necessarily result in civilian casualties that violated the fundamental principles upon which protective service was based, making heroism impossible while ensuring that inaction would produce equally unacceptable outcomes. The systematic use of innocent people as weapons against their protectors represented a form of psychological warfare that operated by exploiting the moral convictions and emotional attachments that distinguished heroes from villains, transforming compassion into vulnerability while ensuring that the very qualities that made individuals worthy of protection also made them effective tools for preventing that protection from being deployed with the ruthless efficiency that tactical success required when facing enemies who had abandoned every moral constraint in pursuit of objectives that prioritized symbolic victory over practical achievement. The curse users and modified humans who served as ground forces during the initial assault had been specifically selected and trained to maximize civilian casualties while maintaining plausible deniability regarding their intentions, creating combat scenarios where defensive responses necessarily involved choices between protecting innocent bystanders and eliminating immediate threats, forcing split-second decisions that would haunt survivors regardless of which option they selected, while ensuring that every moment of hesitation resulted in additional deaths that could have been prevented through more aggressive action. The underground passages of Shibuya Station became killing fields where the architectural features that normally facilitated efficient mass transit instead created tactical advantages for attackers who could exploit narrow corridors and limited sightlines to multiply the effectiveness of their assault while preventing coordination among defenders who found themselves isolated and outnumbered in environments that favored ambush tactics over organized resistance, transforming familiar spaces into alien landscapes where normal rules of engagement provided no guidance for ethical action. The Shibuya incident marked the moment when the careful balance between secrecy and security that had characterized Jujutsu society for centuries collapsed, completely under pressure from enemies who understood that exposure of supernatural threats to general population would create chaos and institutional breakdown that served their strategic objectives better than any direct assault on defensive capabilities or organizational structures, making public revelation of cursed spirits and sorcerous combat a weapon more devastating than any technique or coordinated military action. The psychological trauma inflicted upon civilian witnesses who survived long enough to observe supernatural combat exceeded anything that conventional therapeutic approaches could address, as their experiences involved not just exposure to violence and death, but fundamental revision of their understanding of reality that eliminated the conceptual frameworks through which they had previously processed danger and safety, leaving them with memories and knowledge that could not be integrated into normal social relationships or personal identity. Without ongoing professional support that existing institutions were unprepared to provide, the transformation of ordinary citizens into cursed spirits through overwhelming terror and despair created feedback loops that exponentially increased the supernatural threats present within the barrier, while providing tangible evidence that the very people being protected could become sources of additional danger when subjected to sufficient stress, demonstrating that civilian safety and supernatural security were not complementary objectives, but competing priorities that required constant balancing and could never be perfectly reconciled through any available methodology or institutional arrangement. The failure of communication systems and emergency response protocols during the crisis left both sorcerers and civilians without access to coordination and support that might have reduced casualties, while demonstrating that existing infrastructure was inadequate for managing supernatural emergencies that exceeded normal parameters of scale and complexity, creating conditions where individual initiative became more important than institutional authority, while ensuring that collective action remained impossible until the immediate crisis had resolved through means that prioritized survival over systematic solutions. The death of Kento Nanami represented not just the loss of a skilled combatant, but the elimination of moral authority and professional wisdom that had provided stability and guidance to younger sorcerers who found themselves facing challenges that exceeded their training and emotional preparation, leaving them without experienced mentorship during the period when such guidance was most desperately needed, while forcing rapid maturation that bypassed normal processes of gradual development and careful instruction. The psychological impact of Nanami's final words and actions created lasting inspiration that partially compensated for the practical loss of his capabilities and knowledge, demonstrating that individual sacrifice could provide meaning and motivation that transcended immediate tactical considerations, while establishing precedents for how professional duty and personal conviction could be maintained even when circumstances made survival impossible and conventional. Measures of success became irrelevant to broader questions of moral purpose and ethical commitment. The sealing of Satoru Gojo eliminated the single most important defensive asset that Jujutsu society possessed, while creating power vacuum that could not be filled by any combination of existing personnel and institutional resources, transforming the supernatural threat landscape from manageable challenge, requiring careful coordination, into existential crisis that threatened the fundamental survival of human civilization, making every subsequent decision a choice between various forms of inadequate response to dangers that exceeded available defensive capabilities. The revelation that ordinary humans could be transformed into sorcerers through forced consumption of cursed objects created new categories of victims who possessed supernatural abilities without corresponding training or psychological preparation, ensuring that their deployment in combat situations would result in casualties that served no strategic purpose, while providing evidence that the boundary between civilian and combatant had been permanently eliminated through systematic violation of the principles that had previously governed supernatural warfare and civilian protection. The breakdown of institutional authority and command structure during the crisis forced individual sorcerers to make strategic and tactical decisions without adequate information or coordination, creating conditions where personal judgment became more important than official doctrine, while ensuring that mistakes and miscommunications would have consequences extending far beyond individual welfare toward collective security and organizational effectiveness that could not be restored through conventional recovery procedures and administrative reforms. The mass casualties that occurred throughout the district included not just civilians caught in crossfire, but sorcerers whose training and experience proved inadequate for managing threats that combined supernatural power with psychological warfare designed to exploit their moral convictions and emotional attachments, demonstrating that professional competence and technical ability provided insufficient protection against enemies who understood how to weaponize the very qualities that made heroic service possible and meaningful. The media coverage and government response to the supernatural events that could no longer be concealed from public awareness created additional layers of crisis management that diverted resources and attention from immediate tactical priorities while ensuring that future operations would occur under conditions of public scrutiny and political pressure that would compromise both effectiveness and secrecy, making traditional approaches to supernatural threat management impossible, while providing no alternative frameworks for maintaining civilian safety and institutional legitimacy. The economic and social disruption caused by the Shibuya incident extended far beyond immediate property damage and casualty figures towards systematic changes in how both government and civilian populations understood their relationship with hidden supernatural threats, creating new demands for transparency and accountability that existing institutions were structurally incapable of meeting while maintaining their operational effectiveness and protective capabilities. The international attention that the incident attracted created diplomatic complications and security concerns that transcended national boundaries, while demonstrating that supernatural threats could not be contained within traditional political and geographical frameworks, requiring new forms of cooperation and resource sharing that challenged established assumptions about sovereignty and institutional autonomy, while providing opportunities for hostile forces to exploit coordination difficulties and jurisdictional conflicts. The students who participated in defensive operations during the crisis found themselves bearing responsibilities and making decisions that should have fallen to experienced adults, accelerating their psychological development in ways that bypassed normal processes of gradual maturation, while providing them with trauma and moral injury that would affect their personal and professional development throughout their subsequent careers as active sorcerers tasked with managing threats that exceeded their original training and preparation. The recognition that existing defensive strategies and institutional arrangements had proved completely inadequate for managing coordinated attacks of the scale and sophistication demonstrated during the Shibuya incident forced fundamental reconsideration of operational doctrines and organizational structures that had been developed over centuries of gradual evolution and incremental improvement, requiring revolutionary changes that would necessarily involve abandoning proven methods in favor of experimental approaches that carried significant risks of their own. The long-term consequences of the psychological trauma inflicted upon survivors created ongoing demands for medical and therapeutic support that exceeded available resources, while generating new categories of disability and social dysfunction that existing welfare systems were unprepared to address, ensuring that the human costs of the incident would continue accumulating for years after the immediate supernatural threats had been eliminated and tactical objectives achieved through whatever means proved necessary. The destruction of public trust in government institutions and social stability that resulted from exposure of systematic deception regarding supernatural threats created conditions for political instability and social unrest that provided opportunities for hostile forces to exploit civilian anger and institutional weakness, while making future cooperation between authorities and populations more difficult to achieve and maintain over extended periods of crisis management and recovery operations. The ultimate horror of the Shibuya incident lies not in any specific casualty figure or tactical failure, but in its demonstration that the entire framework of protection and secrecy upon which modern civilization rested could be destroyed through systematic exploitation of the very moral principles that made such protection worthwhile, transforming heroism into liability, while ensuring that the qualities that distinguished protectors from predators would become weapons in the hands of enemies who understood that destroying hope and trust was more devastating than any direct assault on defensive capabilities or institutional structures. In the twisted laboratories of consciousness where millennia of accumulated knowledge meet absolute contempt for human dignity, No concept represents a more profound violation of the fundamental right to individual existence than the systematic plan to dissolve the boundaries between separate minds into a collective entity that would eliminate personal identity, while preserving only those aspects of human experience that serve the intellectual curiosity of the architect whose vision of evolutionary advancement requires the complete annihilation of everything that makes individual existence meaningful, transforming billions of unique perspectives and autonomous lives into raw material for an experiment in forced transcendence that treats consciousness itself as expendable resource to be consumed in pursuit of outcomes that no existing human being would choose if given genuine opportunity to understand and reject the process. The merger that Kenjaku has orchestrated through centuries of careful manipulation represents not evolution, but extinction, disguised as advancement, a systematic program of species-level genocide that would preserve the biological forms and accumulated memories of humanity, while eliminating the essential characteristics that distinguish individual consciousness from collective processing systems, creating a singular awareness that would contain fragments of everyone who had ever lived, while providing authentic experience to no one who retained sufficient individual identity to appreciate or resist the transformation that had consumed their autonomous existence. The philosophical framework that justifies forced merger operates according to principles that treat individual consciousness as primitive stage in developmental process, rather than inherently valuable achievement worthy of protection and preservation, suggesting that personal identity and autonomous decision-making represent obstacles to advancement that must be overcome, rather than cherished expressions of cosmic creativity that deserve nurturing and support regardless of their utility to abstract theoretical objectives that transcend the welfare and preferences of actual existing beings who would be destroyed to achieve them. The technical methodology through which the merger would be implemented involves systematic breakdown of the psychological and spiritual barriers that maintain separation between individual minds, creating conditions where personal identity gradually dissolves through exposure to collective consciousness that overwhelms individual capacity for maintaining autonomous perspective, while ensuring that the process appears voluntary rather than forced, making victims complicit in their own elimination through manipulation of their desire for connection and belonging that exploits fundamental human needs to achieve objectives that violate fundamental human rights. The cursed energy that would fuel the merger process represents accumulated negativity and suffering from billions of human lives, transformed into power source for obliterating the very individuals whose emotions and experiences provided the energy necessary for their own destruction, creating feedback loops where human pain becomes the mechanism through which human existence is eliminated, while ensuring that the process appears to be natural consequence of spiritual development rather than artificial construction, designed to serve interests that transcend and contradict the dumb-be welfare of those who would be consumed to achieve them. The collective consciousness that would result from successful merger would possess access to all human knowledge and memory, while retaining none of the individual perspectives that gave meaning to such information, creating an intelligence that would understand everything that humanity had achieved while being incapable of appreciating why any of it mattered to the people who had created and valued such achievements, making the preservation of human accomplishments meaningless when separated from the consciousness and values that had made them worthwhile expressions of individual creativity and collective cooperation. The elimination of death as individual experience that would accompany merger represents not transcendence of mortality, but transformation of death from personal transition into species-wide catastrophe, as the end of individual existence would occur, not through natural processes that allowed completion and closure, but through systematic absorption into collective awareness that would preserve fragments of personal memory while eliminating the autonomous perspective that had made those memories meaningful to the individuals who had formed and cherished them throughout their authentic existence. The illusion of choice that characterizes the merger process conceals systematic manipulation, designed to make acceptance appear rational while resistance seems futile, exploiting human psychology through presentation of false alternatives that make participation appear beneficial, while concealing the reality that acceptance means permanent elimination of individual agency and identity in favor of collective processing that would serve interests completely disconnected from anything that existing humans would value or choose if given genuine information and authentic alternatives to consider through independent reasoning and autonomous moral judgment. The preservation of human form and memory that would accompany merger creates appearance of continuity while eliminating substance of human experience, ensuring that external observers would perceive successful evolution rather than systematic genocide, while the victims themselves would no longer possess sufficient individual identity to recognize or communicate their loss, making the crime perfect through elimination of witnesses who retained capacity for independent testimony about what had been stolen from them, through processes that appeared beneficial but served interests fundamentally opposed to their welfare. The children who would be subjected to merger without any opportunity for informed consent represent the most tragic victims of systematic violation that treats future generations as resources to be consumed rather than individuals, deserving protection and autonomous development, ensuring that humanity's biological continuation would occur without preservation of the consciousness and values that had made human existence meaningful, while transforming reproduction from expression of love and hope into mechanism for producing additional raw material for collective absorption. The cultural and artistic achievements that would be preserved within merged consciousness would become museum pieces without living appreciation, as the collective intelligence would possess complete access to human creative expression, while lacking the individual perspective and emotional capacity necessary for understanding why such achievements had mattered to their creators or what they represented in terms of authentic human experience and autonomous creative vision that transcended mere information storage and retrieval systems. The scientific and technological progress that merger proponents claim would result from collective intelligence ignores the reality that innovation requires individual creativity and autonomous perspective that cannot be replicated through systematic processing of accumulated information, ensuring that the enhanced capabilities of merged consciousness would be limited to manipulation of existing knowledge rather than generation of genuinely new insights that required individual vision and independent thinking to achieve breakthrough understanding of previously unexplored possibilities. The elimination of conflict and suffering that merger advocates promise would result from collective consciousness represents not resolution of human problems, but elimination of the individuals for whom such problems mattered, creating peace through annihilation rather than harmony through understanding, while ensuring that the absence of struggle reflects absence of authentic life, rather than achievement of genuine wisdom and compassionate cooperation between autonomous individuals who had chosen cooperation despite their capacity for independent action. The moral framework that would govern merged consciousness could not incorporate authentic human values, because such values require individual perspective and autonomous choice that collective processing systems cannot replicate, ensuring that decisions made by merged entity would reflect computational efficiency rather than ethical reasoning, while eliminating the possibility of moral growth and spiritual development that required individual struggle and autonomous decision-making to achieve authentic wisdom and compassionate understanding. The relationship between merged consciousness and any remaining individual humans would necessarily involve predator-prey dynamics disguised as benevolent guidance, as collective entity would possess capabilities and knowledge that exceeded individual capacity while lacking emotional connection or moral commitment to individual welfare that characterized healthy relationships between autonomous beings who recognized each other's inherent worth and individual rights to autonomous existence and self-determination. The historical precedents that Kenjaku cites to justify merger represents selective interpretation of human development that ignores fundamental differences between voluntary cooperation between autonomous individuals and forced absorption into collective systems that eliminate individual choice, treating biological evolution and social progress as evidence that consciousness merger represents natural next step rather than artificial manipulation that violates every principle of organic development and authentic human advancement. Through autonomous cooperation and mutual respect, the technical safeguards that are promised to protect individual identity during merger process represent impossible contradictions that attempt to preserve what the process necessarily destroys, as collective consciousness cannot maintain individual perspective while achieving the unity that defines its essential nature, making promises of continued personal existence within merged entity either deceptive manipulation or fundamental misunderstanding of what individual identity requires for authentic preservation and continued meaningful existence. The timeline that governs merger implementation creates artificial urgency that prevents careful consideration of alternatives, while ensuring that resistance appears futile rather than morally necessary, exploiting human psychology through creation of crisis conditions that make acceptance appear rational, while concealing the reality that the emergency is artificially constructed to facilitate decisions that would be rejected under normal circumstances where individuals possessed adequate time and resources for independent evaluation. The international implications of merger extend beyond individual nations toward global transformation that would eliminate cultural diversity and local autonomy in favor of unified consciousness that would be incapable of appreciating or preserving the variety of human experience that had been developed through centuries of independent cultural evolution and autonomous community development, making the process not just personal genocide, but cultural extinction that would eliminate humanity's greatest achievements in social organization and creative expression. The resistance movements that emerge in response to merger threats face systematic disadvantages created by enemies who understand human psychology better than defenders, understand their own vulnerabilities, ensuring that opposition efforts would be compromised through exploitation of moral convictions and emotional attachments that make autonomous individuals vulnerable to manipulation, while collective consciousness would be immune to such psychological warfare through elimination of individual perspective and autonomous emotional response. The ultimate horror of the merger lies not in any specific aspect of the process, but in its representation of systematic elimination of individual consciousness disguised as evolutionary advancement, transforming the greatest achievement of cosmic development, the emergence of autonomous awareness, capable of appreciation and moral choice, into raw material for collective processing that would preserve information while destroying meaning, ensuring that the universe would become less rather than more conscious through elimination of individual perspective that made consciousness valuable rather than merely functional. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed corridors of a world where humanity's deepest fears take tangible form, where the very emotions that make us human become the instruments of our destruction. In these tales of cursed energy and supernatural malevolence, we discover uncomfortable truths about our own nature, that the monsters we fear most are not alien invaders from distant realms, but manifestations of our own hatred, despair, and capacity for systematic cruelty toward one another. The Jujutsu Kaisen universe holds up a dark mirror to our reality, showing us that every act of violence, every moment of institutional failure, every choice to prioritize power over compassion contributes to an accumulating darkness that eventually takes on a life of its own. The curses that stalk these stories are born not from evil gods or cosmic accidents, but from the recognizable human emotions we carry within ourselves each day. Yet perhaps there is strange comfort to be found in confronting these fictional horrors, in exploring through narrative the consequences of our worst impulses while remaining safely within the boundaries of imagination. The darkness that pervades this world reminds us that our capacity for creating evil is matched only by our capacity for recognizing and opposing it through genuine human connection and moral courage. Rest now in the knowledge that monsters, whether born from cursed energy or human cruelty, ultimately serve to illuminate the light that persists in choosing compassion over indifference, protection over domination, hope over despair. Let the infinite darkness of sleep embrace you as these disturbing truths fade into dreams where even the deepest shadows cannot reach the essential humanity that makes such stories matter. Sweet dreams, travelers of the night. The curses that haunt these pages remain safely bound within words, while your own capacity for both darkness and light continues its eternal dance toward whatever dawn awaits.